reminders of imminence and mortality. In fairy tales, matter often has a life of its own. The animateness of the non-human in fairy tales fascinates me. There must be an allegiance between the inanimate world that was once seen as animated and women's colonized, objectified, inert body. In his book, Once Upon a Time, on the Nature of Fairy Tales, Luthie writes about how the deceased in fairy tales enter into the realm of objects and the play of forces. The realm of plants, animals, and the deceased embodied in the hazel tree, the doves, and the mother render their friendly assistance to helpless men in the Cinderella fairy tale. I'm also thinking of Vasilisa in the Forest, a Russian version of Cinderella, in which the doll left behind by Vasilisa's dead mother aids Vasilisa in overcoming the obstacles that she faces. Zipes points out that the first fairy tale writers that used objects as animate were Hoffmann, Hans Christian Andersen, and Oscar Wilde. But the animateness of the non-human world was always present in oral folk tales, a remnant of an animistic cosmology that did not see earth and body as mere objects to be dominated and controlled. In fairy tales, objects come to the aid of characters if they are morally deserving of such aid. So it gets really theoretical. I might skip over that. And that. So I'm going to start with this quote by Walter Benjamin on the nature of storytelling. Boredom is the dream bird that hatches the egg of experience. A rustling in the leaves drives him away. His nesting places, the activities that are intimately associated with boredom, are already extinct in the cities and are declining in the country as well. With this, the gift for listening is lost, and the community of listeners disappears. For storytelling is always an art of repeating stories, and this art is lost when stories are no longer retained. It is lost because there is no more weaving and spinning to go on while they are being listened to. Benjamin echoes Leskov's view of writing not as a liberal art, but as a form of craftsmanship, one that historically occurred in the ambience of work. Benjamin writes that it is in these self-forgetful moments, when lost in the rhythms and monotonies of craft work, that the story seizes a listener and plants a seed for a retelling. In this modern age, the old web of storytelling is unraveling as these older forms of craftsmanship have become obsolete, or novel and anachronistic at best. Since storytelling thrives in the milieu of experience, each sphere of life has historically had its own form of storytellers. Seamen told tales of faraway places, craftsmen and farmers passed down local traditions. Traveling journeymen would settle down and become craftsmen. The knowledge of the past was retained in natives of a place, while knowledge of faraway lands was brought back by travelers. I do believe that each sphere of life has its own form of storytellers. I strive towards a writing that does not sever art from life, and I believe that life experience is a rich well from which to draw, and that a variety of life experience is an asset to a writer. In an article in the Interstitial Journal Review, Jack Zipes, fairy tale historian, writes, "Fairy tales by their nature are subversive, not all but most. This is because they depict a counterworld based on naive morality that stands in opposition to the corrupt real world based on the notion that might makes right. When I think of fairy tales as they've contributed to my development of my sense of self and worldview, I immediately think of my grandmother, who I was raised by in my early childhood. I was nurtured on a steady diet of Slavic folklore and classical fairy tales, all passed down orally. My grandmother is also a treasure chest of shorter narrative forms and frequently repeated rhyming aphorisms, sayings, and fables. The way that I originally received fairy tales exemplifies their hybrid nature. Though communicated to me orally throughout the years, I recognize that many were based on classic literary versions of the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen, while others were tales of Vasilisa and Baba Yaga. Some were mixtures of these classical versions with Russian mythology, others were based on Pushkin or popular children's literature and TV, such as Buratina, a Soviet version of Pinocchio. Others have origins that I still can't place and were probably passed down to my grandmother by her parents or grandparents. The oral tradition was evident in those tales that were extremely repetitive and often rhymed. I think that her frequent tellings, recalled from memory, allowed my grandmother to embellish them and to be innovative in her own right as a creative storyteller. I do recall that the virtues encouraged in the female protagonists of the tales she told were often humility and loyalty, and rarely daring or outspokenness. While in certain ways women in those stories weren't encouraged to take up space, other types of courage were rewarded: perseverance through hardship, kindness and compassion to those less fortunate, dedication and loyalty to loved ones. At least in my grandmother's retellings, some of these qualities did not seem regressive necessarily. Though nearly 85 years old and socially conservative, perhaps her notions of strong womanhood were projected in her tales. Humility and loyalty were emphasized, but so was a dedication to stand up for and seek out justice. While these were not necessarily radical qualities when it comes to subverting traditional gender relations, I did perceive the female protagonists in her stories as strong in their own right. They were survivors of cruel and abusive step-parents. They received wisdom from aspects of the natural world that others chose to ignore. They dedicated themselves to the ones they loved and showed compassion despite being recipients of cruelty. This probably informed a lot of my own artistic and aesthetic predilections, my ethics, and conceptions of myself. In the context of patriarchy, selflessness and humility, or a steadfast dedication to love and compassion, are not always empowering qualities for women to possess. However, I do see these qualities as generating from a particularly feminine sort of strength, and think that those of us that have been conditioned to embody feminine qualities but are queer and want to define our identities for ourselves must wrestle with the complexity and vulnerability of embracing a femininity that we must rewrite. How am I on time?
Got 3.5 minutes left.
Now that I work as a library assistant in a rural library in the South, my job is reinforcing what I already know, just how vital and universal of a need story is. People consume movies and books voraciously, gush to one another about these stories passionately, relate to one another over them as strangers. The soul needs story like the body needs water. People from all walks of life check out DVDs and books to get them through the drudgery of the work week, through loneliness, boredom, or alienation. Fantasy is what imbues people's realities with meaning and brings them together. The narratives they consume validate them and shape their imaginations and how they conceive of themselves and their lives. I hate the judgmental, puritanical connotations of the term escapism. What is so wrong with wanting a reprieve from the inadequacies of one's reality? This disparages the intelligence of the imagination and of the average person. It makes it seem as though nothing can be learned during this escape, as though nothing is brought back. On the contrary, I believe that people are influenced in the process of being absorbed into story, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse, and that they do integrate their imaginings socially to an extent. Perhaps this is why I'm drawn to Perhaps this is why I'm drawn to a wide range of literature. It is interesting to be writing on these questions, on the role of story, on literature and folklore, on accessibility and experimentation, while studying experimental literature and at the same time working in an institution that exists to provide the public with access to story and most often to popular mass-mediated narratives. Zipes wrote of how the folklore of primary orality is different than the mass-mediated fairy tales of today, and that today's popular story no longer answers to an active collective audience. The reciprocal relationship between story and storyteller has become one-sided and hierarchical, and does not foster the listener or viewer's sense of agency. I think that this is what is missing in popular art today. In art's severance from life, and in the popular story severance from an active participating audience. It has lost its liberatory quality and has become a force of social homogenization rather than one of community and individual empowerment. I believe that this is what is missing. I am relatively inexperienced, and I am sure that there are many people out there who have thought on these questions longer than I have. So I am posing this as a question whose answers I have just begun to pursue. The modern fairy tale no longer answers to people's needs, but prescribes them. Folk tales once blurred these distinctions between art and entertainment, between literature and folklore. They were originally told on dark evenings over chores and household tasks, and they were told to me in the same tradition by my grandmother as she was making dinner, washing me in the bath, or tucking me into bed. My grandmother, who grew up in a tiny village in the very north of Arkhangelsk, and still retained her village ways after many years in America, still grinding her meat with a meat grinder and washing her clothes in the bathtub with a washboard. They are ultimately a people's art form. They belong to everyone. I'm sure that much of my worldview was shaped by these stories, and I believe they helped me deal with my situation as a child. After all, fairy tales are full of dark themes, child abuse being one of the main ones.